Welcome everyone. My name is Paul Weinstein. I'm a GM here at Wheelhouse DMG. First question, I just wanted to point out just some housekeeping. If you've got any questions, please hit us up in the Q&A box. If one of you could just hit the Q&A box just to say hi to make sure that that's working, that would be wonderful. And to make sure that we've got folks hearing us right now. Excellent. Thank you. So who we are Wheelhouse DMG. We're based in Seattle, but everywhere. We've been in business for over 15 years. And for the better part of that, we've been working with healthcare, medical devices, payers, and the like. For our clients, we are trusted guides, and we have a set of core values that we abide by and kind of have built into everything that we do. For us, what we do is we solve our clients' toughest digital challenges. We've been solving them for the likes of NASA and Aegis Living and Fujitsu and even the Metropolitan Museum of New York. But the bulk of our work is really in healthcare, where we've worked with some of the most sophisticated healthcare organizations and medical device clients in the US and the world. We're performance marketing for healthcare. We do all kinds of things, more than what we'll just talk about today, which is, around HIPAA compliant analytics and particularly implementing GTM server side. But we build our own technology. We help our clients with all things like from digital strategy, running digital advertising in a HIPAA compliant way. We provide technical services, helping understand folks' MarTech stacks and even providing additional strategy and implementation support there. Creative and design is becoming more and more important today with how the world is working, particularly in advertising. And then we bring it all together in a one wheelhouse fashion. With me today are our two leaders in our marketing sciences team and technical services. So Michael will be helping answer questions today. He is our director of marketing sciences, as well as Dustin, who's going to be our primary lead here running us through. Dustin's been our VP for some time. I've been working with Dustin for almost 10 years. And so Dustin's going to take us through the bulk of the content. So Dustin, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Super excited to be talking to everyone today about GTM and compliance and how we approach this problem. So today we're going to be covering why are we here? We're going to touch slightly again on recent OCR guidance and kind of what created the problem of needing to implement analytics in a compliant way. We're going to do a deep dive into setup and configuration of a compliant server-side container, where we talk about hosting options, basic configuration considerations. We're going to talk about security considerations too, because there is some IT setup for this and some things IT needs to consider. And then overall, we want to talk about the roles that we think are required to make a compliant analytics program work. And this is even beyond GTM, just some kind of table stakes for as you're thinking about analytics and compliance. So why we are here. So back in December of 2022, the Office of Civil Rights dropped a bomb. They brought marketing metadata into the fold of what might be considered PHI and therefore applicable to HIPAA compliance, security, and privacy rules. So suddenly marketers had to consider the PHI considerations under HIPAA of data in considering things like whether a visitor to your site was a patient or maybe a future patient, whether the user is logged in or not. We have to start keeping track of what we're doing with identifying numbers, right? Because if we combine a unique identifying number or IP address with medical data, that can tell us a lot about our person and violate HIPAA. And then we really had to start considering journeys of where people were researching medical conditions and things that are really sensitive. That spot in that place I don't want to talk about. I don't want the world to be tracking me as I'm researching through that. And then, we also have to consider the profiles that others are building. And the big one in 2022 was Meta, right? And their big vacuum cleaner of a process. So what does this mean? So when we start talking about needing to treat marketing data in a compliant way, it's really left like marketers in the dark and in a very real way, right? We have a tightening regulatory landscape. We now have to think about data being shared under a BAA. And in many cases, we've been finding that healthcare has simply been pulling off analytics completely, right? That is compliant. We can have no data. But of course, as marketers, we know that this has a major impact on top line data and how that feeds our company and how we're able to generate revenue, and can be really outsized if we can't measure things. Now, first, we want to address a common misconception, which is that GTM cannot be used by covered entities in a compliant way. This is just not true, and we'll get into that in a minute. It can be used if we control our data collection, we control our data treatment, so introduce some governance into our data pipelines, and we control our data distribution. So compliance isn't about avoiding our data altogether or shutting things off. It's about understanding, how do we manage and handle this data in a compliant way? So, okay, Dustin, that's a nice claim. How do we get there? So Wheelhouse, we've been actually solving this for healthcare for some time. So let's talk just really briefly about how we approach our solution design. We talk to clients about, first and foremost, you have to move server side, right? The days of client-side tags are over. And the reason why is because we can't govern those tags, right? When we install a tag from Google or Meta, right, they're iterating on feature functionality that we basically have no control over. And that's how Meta ended up vacuuming up login form information and other things that were really egregious and caused a cycle of lawsuits out of the OCR guidance. We want you to add a private ID. This is something that we do here at Wheelhouse. This is an ID that's owned and governed by your organization, that's not generated by a platform vendor like Adobe or GTM, right? This ID is ours. That way we can use it in a private ID context. We can share it with appropriate third parties if we want, and we make sure that this ID isn't directly connected to any other identifiers, or is in effect non-identifying of the actual person. We actually like to add some governance in our data collection in our implementations. We also are really big on consent and cookie consent. Data privacy is the future, and there's a lot of folks that aren't currently under anything other than HIPAA, right? You're outside of California, you're outside of Washington, you're not in Europe, maybe you're in the middle of the country in Kansas or Missouri, and you don't have any kind of data privacy regulations compelling you to add a banner on your site. I still think cookie consent is coming for you in the long run, and something that you should think about. We actually add URL blocking and cleansing logic into our data collection so that we're pre-cleaning before we even get to our data hubs, and injection blocking as well to prevent content teams from accidentally injecting analytics through something like a YouTube embed. And last but not least, the whole solution hinges around having some sort of data hub like GTM to manage your data, validate your data, and control it. So what does that look like? So we manage and create a private ID on the client side and kind of create that user session information without tying that to a user. But all events get sent to a compliant server-side data hub. So what we're going to be talking about for the rest of the session is how to make our GTM server-side compliant in this way, so that it can act as our data hub to route data to the right here. So you see these destinations on the right. If you have the right governance in place and the right tools in place, you can control your data in such a way so that you can direct clean data to non-compliant third parties, data that doesn't include any PHI or identifiers, and full fidelity data into a first-party context, like with your CDP or CRM or other first-party data operations. So let's talk about kind of where this all sits and maybe some other tools you could use for Data Hub. We can use Google Tag Manager. New on the scene is FreshPaint. They're very early in VC, but they are part of this ecosystem and this solution as a hub. We're really big fans of Telium and Segment here at Wheelhouse because they're more enterprise and scale driven. And of course, there's the big players in the game like Adobe and Salesforce. All of these organizations have some tools that you can use to kind of create a solution like this. I will say that we recommend GTM be used for lighter scale analytics solutions. And this really comes down to scale, right? When you start needing to scale GTM into cross-organizational use cases or enablement or advanced compliance scenarios, it's not as good of a tool as some of these other ones, but it can still be used very effectively. So let's get into the meat of it. Hey, how do we do this? So this is what we'll be covering in standing this up. First, what are our requirements or basic requirements for a server-side container that is compliant? What are some of our options for hosting? Actually, the nice thing about GTM server-side is how flexible it is to deploy. And then we're going to get into the actual, okay, now we have it hosted. How do we set it up and use it in a compliant way? All right, requirements. Let's start at the beginning. So server-side GTM must be designed for compliance, and that's kind of why we're here today. Right out of the box, everyone knows who's used GTM for a long time that you can add a server-side container and have been able to add a server-side container really easily with a push of a button in Google. But that container isn't compliant by nature. For that container to be compliant, it needs to satisfy these things. And you have to be able to govern your access and control. And that's pretty easy to satisfy with Google's tags and built-in kind of permission system. But what we really need to cover is that the GTM server-side container must be hosted in an environment that satisfies the HIPAA chain of trust, right? So it needs to be in a hosting environment that is covered under BAA. Now that can also be your own self-hosted infrastructure if your organization has that, but we see it mainly deployed in the cloud, right? Either Google Cloud, AWS, or Azure. And then we need to make sure that no data that is under the OCR definition of PHI is shared with third parties that are outside of BAA. And that goes for things like IP addresses, sensitive medical conditions, and the like. So how does this make us compliant, right? What about thinking about our hosting makes this compliant? Well, when we stand up GTM server-side in a compliant environment, it changes it into a first-party system, right? Instead of GTM being a third-party destination at that point, server-side becomes a first-party context. And so this allows us to collect the data that we need and then govern it. An important point that we like to try to make to people is that HIPAA didn't ban the collection of HIPAA data or PHI or marketing data from being collected. They're asking us not to share it with third parties, right? So we, as long as the data is in a first-party context, can collect that data and then treat it in a way that it can be handled appropriately. All right, so let's talk about setup. So let's talk about the components here. So when we're talking about GTM, we still are going to have our browser environment, right? We have our browser, and there is, in some instances, going to be a GTM tag manager or another tag manager in place. That stays, although we're going to be using that a little bit differently. The big part of what we're talking about is this server-side container, where we're setting up a server-side container now to send data from the client into this first-party data environment. And this shows you that we can send it to, Google Cloud, Azure, AWS, or self-host, as long as it's compliant. From there, we can send data out to third-party destinations, again, as long as it's clean. And we're also considering first-party data destinations. And if you don't have a first-party data strategy, let's talk. So let's talk about how we get there from here, right? We first need to figure out how we create a container for Google, and how do we provision our server, and where can it be hosted? How do we, and there's a section we're going to talk about the difference around tagging and preview domains, how we configure our server-side container, how we navigate compliance, and talk about some ongoing governance. So some of this might be review for some of you who know how to create a server container, but we're going to go into just the quick how to get started right out of the gate. So you can log into GTM. You need to have an admin account set up, and under container, you can create a new container. You assign it to a domain, and then you're going to want to select a target platform of server. Now, this is just a configuration step. This doesn't configure your server. It's going to ask you if you'd like to provision a server, right? And that provisioning has two options, automatic and manual. Generally, automatic is good for if you are already in Google Cloud and can use their services. Definitely check with your IT team to see if they have Google Cloud under their BAA, because that will be the fastest option to getting your server on its feet. However, there's a lot of organizations we work with that don't have that relationship with Google. Some people have a very bad feeling about Google, in fact, and want things to be on AWS or Azure. If that's you, you want to choose manual for your hosting options. Once that's done, your basic container configuration will be created and in your tag for future use and configuration. Next is, how do we provision that server? Now, again, if you're Google, that was really easy. You can just kind of use their automatic flow, but you have to be careful that any Google Cloud product is covered under BAA and with your IT organization. Let's talk about some other options. AWS, Azure, right? The nice thing about GTM is it's node-based, so any environment that you can use to host a node application, you can use to deploy this. But we're just going to focus on some simple approaches for these systems today. We do have some detailed technical handouts covering AWS and Azure. Google's process, again, is fairly well documented, but if you have questions, we can cover that as well. Please, leave your email with our team and we'll get those over to you. All right, so one of the things we have to think about from setting up a new environment for this system is Google and GTM have a consideration around tagging domains, right? And if any of you have used Google before, you know that when you throw the GTM tag on your site and you just let the default settings go, it starts sending events. Assuming you have Google tags set up, it starts sending events client side, right? What server side does is it swaps out that Google domain or Google destination for custom domains that can be aligned with your domain scheme. So Google actually recommends using a same origin approach. So this would be something like www.myhealthcare.com/metrics becomes a URL that we are sending the event data to instead of that default Google URL. We recommend a subdomain approach, mainly because the same origin approach requires a CDN and some configuration that's complex. We have a kind of a simple version of what we're going to be doing with those domains here, where effectively we're going to be swapping out your destination URLs with those metric URLs. Now, there's also a preview domain, and if you've been a longtime user of GTM, the preview domain is where you do your debugging and your testing, and it creates a similar URL approach. But these things need to be thought about by your team. What do we want to use for measurement? Is it metrics.mydomain.com? Is it www.mydomain.com metrics? And this can get pretty technical, so I'm going to leave it here, and please reach out if you have questions. We can certainly help your team navigate this. So this is where kind of server-side and client-side setup. There's a new concept in GTM, right? And in GTM server-side. So let me roll back a little bit. When it comes to classic GTM, all of you are very familiar with the concept of tags, right? I add my metapixel, I add my Google pixel. And some of you might even know how that works in that it injects JavaScript related to these pixels onto the page and then sends data. In server-side, we're introducing a new concept called clients, and I really want to call that out in particular because it's a little bit different than tags. So since server-side is now away from our client, we actually have two pieces to our data pipeline. We actually have to set up a client to ingest data, and then we set up tags to send data. So clients are how we set up GTM to be received or accept or consume its events. And tags in the server side are similar to client side. They're how we send that data. So GTM server side has a similar UI, and there can be some confusion here. So, please reach out again if you have questions. But generally, this is our data flow. We'll define tag events in Google Tag on the client side. We'll send that data to a GA4 client in the server side. That will be processed by triggers, and then we send that through a process called transformation using transformations. And then we use tags to send that off to tag destinations. So one of the big limitations, and I think harking back to our slide where we were talking about technology, GA4 has a fairly limited way to get data into it. It uses, these clients are the clients available out of box, GA4, Universal Analytics, Web Container, Measurement Protocol, and GA4. These are how we send events in, and Google made it super easy for you if you already have an implementation in one of these contexts. So for example, let's say you're using client-side GTM and you have a lead flow. And as people are going through that lead flow, you are sending off GA4 events and you have that pipeline going. If you install server-side and you take out that client-side tag, you can still reuse all of those lead flow events directly with your new appliance using the GA4 web client here. Because it's designed to accept the same GA4 events that Google accepts natively on their cloud platform. And so then we get into tags. So tags are how you send data out to our destination. And again, that's very similar to how we used to do that on the client side. There are GA4 tags. There is a community store with meta tags and other things. The difference being that rather than JavaScript running on your computer, these are more like data exit points in an API that allows us to send data. Triggers, again, same way, same concept that you're used to on GTM client side. Many of you have been using triggers for years. Server side still uses triggers. We need that same kind of rule sets to trigger data being sent. And when we're defining triggers server-side, the difference again is that instead of responding to client actions like a form submission, we're going to look for data patterns and trigger based on those, like a lead conversion. But wait, okay, I've been talking all of this time and we haven't touched on compliance, right? Ultimately, compliance is how we use these tools together. So when we're thinking about compliance, transformations is really the key functionality that has been added to server side that enables it to be used in a compliant way. Many of you are big fans of Simo. Ahava, he talks about this at great length on his blog and has been tracking the transformation process very well. We're a big fan as well. But before July of 2024, or I guess it was July of 2023, this is a typo. So July of 2023, GTM server-side couldn't be used because it lacked transformation functionality. Now, what transformations really allow us to do is transform our data mid-flight, right? So let's say we have a page location with some sensitive data. If we're looking at this screenshot here, by using transformations, we can augment that event data and replace that page location with a hashed value using some of the tools in the GTM server-side marketplace. And we'll definitely happy to talk about hashing all day. The other part of compliance is really working with your compliance team from the beginning. Compliance isn't just a technical solution. It's really about helping the compliance team understand and enable the marketing team in a way that marketing can get the measurement they need without violating compliance. And so we advocate for early involvement of compliance teams in these structures. We want you to have like really good communication about what you're doing and how you're solving for this. And this is how we overcome but they just told me no, right? We're turning the lights off, right? But by starting to build these relationships and having these conversations, we found it can be very, very valuable. Think about your training and awareness. How are you talking about governance inside? Compliance, making sure you're setting up compliance audits and other things. Policy development, making sure that you know how you're going to ingest and implement new media requests and handle change management around web development. And those types of things are all things that you should consider about compliance and working with your compliance team. And then keep that feedback going. For us, the biggest successes we've seen are when we see multi-stakeholder teams come together and attack this problem as one. All right, we'll speak to a little bit of ongoing governance. So this is just a little bit more depth of what I was speaking about, but when you're planning on setting yourself up for success, these are some things you should really consider, right? Again, hardening that compliance process alignment. I really recommend having a friend in legal if you can make that friend, right? Someone who knows marketing and appreciates that top line perspective and is helping you create the policies and actually even understanding some of the technical nuance of a compliant implementation to help you get the processes in place you need to keep marketing moving. The marketing working with compliance has to have good processes in places so that they can maintain compliance and not have data leaks. Engineering release management communication. I can't tell you how many times website changeover has caused risk and problems with analytics. So we want to get ahead of that. And then creating audit processes. Security considerations for a setup like this is that you do, again, really must host this under BAA. And so you'll be involving your IS team and making sure that that is the case, and your compliance team to make sure paper is in place. Like all HIPAA compliant data handling, everything needs to be transferred over HTTP TLS. We recommend 1.2 because it's a more secure protocol and it encrypted at rest. We talked about tags a little bit. The Google server-side ecosystem provides a fairly small official connector or tag library. Most of your tags are actually community provided. And what that does is that in some cases, we've seen third-party agencies and sometimes third-party developers that are completely unaffiliated with Google or say Meta or any of these folks actually introducing connectors into the marketplace. So there has to be internal processes to review those for security to make sure they're working as advertised and not leaking any unwanted data. Your CI processes for this are very important as you integrate kind of marketing tags and things and such on the Google server side. And one of the late breaking features in server side is that it now actually allows you to serve all the client side dependencies for event management directly from Google server side. So things like your GTAG script or your GTM script can actually be served from your first party environment, keeping them outside of any BAA concerns with connecting with Google. And it's something we highly recommend you enable. So there's been kind of a voiceover about the team, right? And the reason why we're talking about team so much is that the technical solution is actually pretty easy. We can sit down and talk to your tech team and understand the wiring. We can, help your marketing team understand how to apply their, analytics plan or their data plan into GTM and where to hash and how to hash and what tags to use. But if we don't have the right team, the project's going nowhere, right? So here's some recommendations we have when approaching this from a team building standpoint. Make sure you have your digital advertising SMEs involved. An analytics engineer that can help with events and pipelines, and even the configuration of server side. Involve your marketing strategists so that we're designing the right KPIs in the system and understanding their wish list for enablement. Your marketing compliance officer or data compliance officer should be involved for helping you understand your compliance posture. Every organization is different. Some organizations don't have the strict regulations that say a healthcare provider or a medical provider has. So make sure you understand your own compliance. Architecture is important for hosting and scaling any kind of server-side component. And then make sure you involve any reporting stakeholders, again, in making sure we're designing data to be sent out. And again, our technical side of how do we set this up in AWS, how do we set that up in Azure, we didn't have time today to dive into that, and it gets really weedy anyway. So please give us your email and we will send you those how-to documents. So again, the benefit to setting up a server-side architecture approach to GTM is that it really keeps you, it adds control, it gives you control. It is fully configurable, and then it allows you to strengthen and simplify the guidance you need to give to your marketing team, right, to your compliance team in activating this data. The other nice thing is that unlike pulling all of our tags off of our page, this will enable your digital advertising to keep some visibility. Now, when we're talking about sending data to conversion partners that are outside of BAA, we're not going to be sending non-compliant data. So not all platforms can be used in the same way. And we're definitely recommending you evaluate HIPAA-compliant activation partners and advertising partners to even help augment your system. All right, that was super high level. We didn't have a ton of time, so we wanted to make sure we left plenty for questions. Thank you very much.
Yep. if there are any questions, if you want to put them in the Q&A box, we can kind of work through them there and go from there. If there are no questions, then of course, you'll get this recording afterwards, so you can refer to it again and the materials. And as Dustin had shared, we do have the technical how-to step-by-step, like it's multi-page instructions on setting up either AWS or Azure server-side environments to host GTM. So we've got that. And so depending on which environment that you guys are operating in, just let us know which one of those you'd like, and we'd be happy to send that off afterwards. So if there are any questions, let us know. Yep, I've got a question. Can you talk a little bit about why the structure of server-side GTM helps it be compliant?
Sure, absolutely. Let me see if I can find our structure slides real quick. So compliance is really about, with HIPAA data or PHI, has a lot to do about who owns the data, right? So if I am a healthcare provider and I'm providing services to a patient, it's assumed that I'm going to have charts for that patient, right? That I'm going to keep their medical data. And that's why we have the regulations. So there are standardized rules in how different folks treat that data and handle that within their organization, but also how they share that data. So since GTM server-side is essentially a fairly lightweight software application, we can deploy it in a environment that we control that is technically under our purview as an IT organization, under our HIPAA compliance and security rules. So for example, if you're a hospital, you have an IS or IT organization that works with your security officer to define the processes and infrastructure for how, like, where are we storing that medical data? Where can it live? How is it handled? What we're doing with server side is we're putting it in that same type of context of a first party structure where we own it. Now, we don't own the software that's running, but we own the environment that it's in. So what happens here in this architecture diagram is when I am logging into your website, if and I'm close, say there's a landing page event or a page view event, that gets sent off through this green arrow here to server side through your firewall in an encrypted manner that is effectively you still own, because that environment is under BAA, or that environment is self-hosted and under your rules for HIPAA compliance, right? And our BAA is the agreement that we use between our organization as a covered entity and various vendors that might be handling our data.
With client-side GTM, we don't control, right, where the data is being sent, right? There's a script on our site, and that script is sending whatever data from whatever library that script is controlling to its own destination, directly to, in this case, Google. What we're doing is we're abstracting that part of it and saying, okay, we're going to send that data to our own server, giving us control, and we're going to connect back to GA4 or marketing partner via API. Structurally, with that API, we can control at a attribute level what is and is not sent, right? And with the transforms capability within GTM, we can decide which is obfuscated, de-identified, hashed, or not sent at all. So the structure of abstracting this and moving the collection server side to where we have now control of the data before it goes out is the structural kind of change that takes place that allows this to be compliant. I hope that answers the question.
Well, good.
Yeah, so I think this is a follow-up question. So and so then the follow-up, is this true even if you're using something like GA4 client, but not sending it to GA? i.e. no GA tag in the container. It's all de-identified before sending to GA, essentially. Yes. So the collection is happening, and we're collecting but not sending, right? We're going to collect it, send it server side. We're going to decide what gets sent to GA4 after that. So in client side GA4, right, we're collecting and sending straight to GA4, and there's no opportunity to intervene, right, at that point. Server side allows us that step to intervene where we can now control the data, how it's being treated, and then where it's being sent. So yes.
Yeah, and to be clear, so they're talking about the GA client. And so yes, this is exactly what the slide represents, is that what Google allows you to do is configure where that tag is sending data, right? So if right, default, it's sending it to Google, right? When you install on your page. Once you set up server side and update your configuration, now you're sending it to your private server.
Which is where you have control.
Exactly.
And then I've got another question. If you do transformations in server-side GTM, where do you store what each ID means?
Okay, so if we're thinking about IDs, ID handling, ID stitching, and there's a number of IDs that we deal with in marketing, like a Google Click ID or a Facebook Click ID or those types of things. Now, if you need to store those things, then what we recommend is that's what your first-party data storage is for. So if GTM server side is your data hub, it's kind of a staging place to send data on, almost like a train station, right? Where we're going to go to the station first, we're going to see what destination we need to go to, and then we'll head out to that destination. When we're talking about these IDs, we want to set up a first-party data store that we're sending full fidelity data to. Now, this could be, say, an AWS database. It could be any kind of SQL or relational database that exists in secure infrastructure. It could also be other products like Snowflake or other compliant data stores. But we recommend that you're sending clean data off to third parties, but you're actually sending full fidelity data, including IP addresses, geolocations, IDs, to this first-party context where you can then store those IDs and use resolution stitching, add CDP, add marketing activation, right? That's a whole nother conversation around first-party data strategy, Tricia, but I think overall, the nice thing about server side is that we can add different types of data connectors, and there are a lot of options for getting data out and back into a first-party database for future analysis.
Hopefully that answers that question.
And so there's definitely, like, we acknowledge this is a little bit of that old meme for those of you that are my age around how you draw an owl, right? A top circle, a bottom circle, and suddenly finish the owl, right? There's a lot of details in here, but those details are very organization specific around your KPIs, your infrastructure, your needs, your budgets. And we'd be happy to talk to you about, how to kind of fold this general concept into applying it for you. So please reach out.
All right. Well, thank you again, everyone, for attending. If you've got any follow-up questions, you know how to get a hold of us. We'd be happy to schedule a follow-up call. And again, we do have those extra instructions for setting up AWS or Azure server-side environments for you. Very detailed and highly technical. So if you want those, please reach out and we'd be happy to send those on. All right. Thank you all for attending this webinar, and have a great afternoon or evening.
Really appreciate your time. Thank you very much.